Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending upon where you might be. This is Ruben Rodriguez with SSH Communication Security. I'd like to thank everyone for taking time out of your day to join us today for this webinar. It's actually the first in a series. This is what we're terming the Mythcrackers series. And this particular webinar today is going to discuss the myth of the SSH key discovery. Again, the first in a series of 4, more to come, and Joe, one of our speakers, will give you additional information about that. So let's not waste any more time today and get this session kicked off. By doing so, I would like to introduce our 2 panelists today, those being Mr. Joe Scaff and Mr. Matthew McKenna. Joe Scaff is from our Global Customer Services Group, and he's responsible for managing the global technical sales and support of SSH Communications Security. He has over 12 years of experience in the information technology and information security business, and as the Director of Global Customer Services, he manages all of the high-performance and advanced technical teams that report to him for the large organizations that we support here at SSH Communications Security. And joining him on the panel is Matthew McKenna. He is our Chief Commercial Officer, and he brings over 10 years of high-tech sales and marketing experience to SSH. And his expertise is obviously here to help us strategically deliver technology solutions that can help us anticipate the market needs and become a company leader that SSH Communications has become in this day and age. So with that, I would like to turn this over to Mr. Joe Scaff to kick this off. And Joe, if you can, I think you're already sharing your screen. Everyone should see the first screen. And one final note for everyone on the session, you are in listen-only mode. If you do have any questions that come up during this presentation, please use the GoToMeeting chat function, and I will be sure to relay that over to Joe or Matthew. So Joe, thank you, and please take it away.
Thank you, Ruben. So as Ruben mentioned, this is the first of our series of 4 of monthly Mythcrackers series. Today we'll be talking about the myth of SSH key discovery. Next month we'll be going over the myth of the private key, and we'll touch a little bit on it today, but won't go into too much details. We'll go into much more details next month on kind of the ability to be able to scan your environment for all your private keys and the myth around that. Third one in February will be the myth of key rotation and the kind of the risks around not rotating your keys, along with the risk of rotating your keys without the proper management or the proper monitoring in place in order to do that. And lastly, the myth of integrated PAM integration. So moving forward, as I mentioned, this is the first part, myth of key discovery, and Ruben was nice enough to introduce me already, so we'll move forward. The first thing I'd like to cover, because this is the first of our series, is a quick introduction about who SSH, the company, is, who we are, why SSH or Secure Shell is so important for many organizations, and how do SSH keys work, just to give everybody a baseline of what we're going to be talking about once we talk about what the myth of key discovery is and how important that is. And of course, the importance is related to the risks and of the risks of major incidents and threats within any organization, whether it be large, small, or medium-sized organizations. So SSH Communications, we actually are the original inventors of the SSH protocol. Our CEO, our Chief Innovation Officer, Tatu Yelanen, was the original inventor of the protocol. And it's the original source for OpenSSH because of that, because it was released out into open source, and then we became a commercial company shortly after that. We are traded on the Helsinki NASDAQ. We have over 3,000 customers and are in many of the largest banks and financial institutions in the world. What we do, we provide a means to discover, monitor, and control privileged access and encrypted traffic without disrupting the flow of information processes and work practices. So what that means is we focus on access management, access controls, and key management, encrypted channel monitoring, and data in transit encryption. And that's kind of the basis of all the things we do. So why is SSH or Secure Shell important? First, in order to understand its importance, we have to understand what it's used for. So one of the main things is remote login or administration of systems, also remote command execution, secure file transfer, and secure data transfer, whether it's tunneling a legacy application or whatnot. Essentially, the SSH is the plumbing of almost any infrastructure or environment that's out there. As I mentioned, it's available both open source and commercial implementations. It's a client-server application for making connections between two machines, and it's widely used on pretty much every operating system out there. To give a little bit more on what primarily the SSH or Secure Shell is used for, Forrester did a report recently, and I wanted to group it into kind of the main aspects of what I see in the customers we work with and the companies that talk to us about what they're using SSH for. The first one is automated file transfer, whether it's machine-to-machine transactions, enabling automated backups, or simply passing data off to another server to be processed for various different things. Probably the number one thing that we see in our own environments or in the customer environments we work with. Second is, as I mentioned, administration controls, administration access control. So allowing those operations people to access systems to do the administration that's needed on a day-to-day basis. As I mentioned, it's the plumbing layer. It keeps everything running. Also data center management automation, certainly important as some of the processes are automated more and more these days. One of the things that you don't hear about as much is the availability to do remote access like a VPN through SSH. Some will argue it's not the same thing, but it is something that came up in the Forrester report so as one of the top items, so I wanted to bring it up there, and of course, securing your wide area networks. Given all that it's used for, there's certainly, obviously there's going to be some advantages of using a tool or protocol like SSH, but you have to be able to manage it, and you have to be able to know what the attackers or what the problems might be. In this case, we say for evil. Data transit encryption, of course, you prevent man-in-the-middle attacks. You're able to encrypt your sensitive information, but it's also blind to security operations or forensic teams. Because that data is encrypted, it's nearly impossible to be able to see inside that track to see if you have information like PCI data going through it that shouldn't. Excuse me. Remote access to systems and applications. Of course, as we mentioned, it's great for administrators and developers to gain access to the systems, but that convenience also allows for attackers to use those authentications and access to those systems in order to compromise those systems or applications. Excuse me. Command execution, similar to remote access, but most of the time command execution is thought of as automated, but allows you to easily copy, delete files and applications for business purposes. But then again, you could have malware that's deployed through that same method if there's an insider, if there's someone that gets into the system. So that needs to be monitored, it needs to be tracked, and who has access to what. And then tunneling. Tunneling is always an interesting one because it's not always thought about. It's something easy. I could certainly be inside my internal corporate network, create a connection outside to my home computer or PC, and set up a remote tunnel. What that allows me to do is it allows me to get access from my home PC inside the internal network. And because it's all encrypted, as we mentioned before, none of the firewalls will pick it up, none of the forensics tools will pick it up in order to be able to tell those people that I might be accessing the internal network whenever I shouldn't maybe be able to have access to it. So again, another Forrester research report of how important is the Secure Shell to your organization and what do you use it for? We already went over what we use it for, but 82% of the organizations that were polled in this Forrester research report say they use Secure Shell in their organization. I have to assume that's probably higher than that. It's a pretty standard protocol that's being used in organizations, but 82% is pretty high, so it shows the overall importance and the usage within an organization. And 68% consider secure shell or SSH important or critical. That's an interesting statistic because it's a bit scary to me, because that means that there's 32% of companies out there that don't consider either securing their data in transit or their infrastructure important, or that maybe they don't have a good understanding of what SSH does and how to manage it. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about what we see as the myth of key discovery, and what brought about this part of this series, and particularly the myth of key discovery, was when we talk with customers, we ask them about their SSH environments, their policies, and things of that sort. And sometimes, not always, we get answers like the ones listed here. We don't have a user authentication key problem. We use SSH keys, but we have them under control or discovered. We already track our SSH keys, we already track what SSH keys are created. We don't use SSH keys, which I find hard to believe. We don't have or allow shared private keys, or we use a jump host to control access to systems. And so going forward, some of those, I think that there's a misunderstanding of what SSH keys can do and how prevalent they are in environments. And we'll go through shortly why I think that, and what we can do to kind of mitigate the risk and make sure that we're not just doing things like discovering the keys, but we also are going to manage those keys as well. Excuse me. There's a lot more to discovering keys than just encryption algorithm size. Of course, you want to have your policy set up to restrict those kinds of things, whether it's the encryption algorithm or the size that's being used within the organization, but it's only part of the story. So given this scenario where I'm pretending that I'll do a discovery or an investigation on server B, and to see if there's keys associated on server, keys that are on server B under the user 2 account. I have server A in red and user 1 in red because we don't necessarily know at the time of discovering the keys on server B where the private key sits, where that connection is coming from. So it's only part of the story. When we do the initial discovery, we can get the key type and size of the file, like I mentioned before. We can get the public key location, but on server A, even if we scan server A, do a discovery of those keys on server A, we don't necessarily know where the private key location is. We may not actually find the private key on server A, and I'll go over that in just a bit as well in more detail. The next part of the story that is very important is production or non-production. If server A is a non-production machine and is connecting to server B, it's a violation of most compliance regulations that say that you have to have separation of duties. And where do you get that information? You can't get that information just from doing a discovery of the keys on those servers itself. Next question that comes up a lot is whether it's an interactive or non-interactive user account. Again, the discovery itself will not tell you that information, so that's part of the myth. Some organizations have restrictions that only interactive users have to be able to connect through a jump host, and non-interactive users are the only ones that can go machine to machine. But how do you actually determine that? You need other information, for example, maybe on a CMDB or something along those lines. Ownership is kind of the next one. I'll skip to the next part as well, because application. What is the application that's using that key? And who is the owner of that key? Who should be responsible of saying whether that key is needed, whether it should be removed, or whether it needs to be rotated or not? So discovering that information, again, can be very difficult for organizations, and it's not something that you can do in initial key scan or discovery. There's additional work that's involved there. And the key age. We can determine through a scan what the key is to some extent. But keys, of course, can be updated if they get edited or anything like that. With open SSH keys, you can have multiple keys in one file, so you can't always determine the oldest key in that particular group of keys that are on a single file. So key age is a bit of a question. We can find some information, but that's why ongoing monitoring and management of those keys is very important, because you can always say how old the key is based on the time that you actually started monitoring and you just made the discovery of that original key. All right. More on the private keys. Again, we'll go over a little bit more, in much more detail in the next Mythcrackers session, but I want to touch on it because it is important. Discovery and eventually trying to manage and lock down private keys is a daunting and near impossible task. Why is that? This is a command. It's an OpenSSH command, actually, and the -I option allows users to specify the location of the private key. And what that means is that it could be on a laptop, and for one thing, you may not want to do a discovery or a scan on every single laptop if you have quite a large organization, tens of thousands of people. Not only can it be on a laptop, you don't know what directory it's going to be under. There are standard locations or directories that the private keys can reside in, but because of this option, you cannot be 100% sure. Not only that, it might be in a standard location, but it's underneath the user's home directory, which is on an NFS mount. In order to do that discovery, there's other things that you need to take into consideration, is if it's an NFS mount that needs to be mounted by logging in as the user itself, or how you get access to that data. Otherwise, a scan may not pick it up if it's on an NFS mount, and that NFS mount is not actually mounted at the time of the scan. And of course, the one we all love could be on a USB drive, sorry. The key could be anywhere, so you could actually carry around the key if your organization allows for USBs to be plugged into your laptop. It might actually be a convenient way to keep to allow for convenience of a user to be able to connect to the machines that they should have access to by plugging that USB into any machine and gaining access that way. It also can be a very scary thought as well, I'm sure you guys recognize. Sorry, one second, let me just grab a drink. All right, thank you, excuse me. So discovery isn't enough. So we talked a little bit about management already and the importance of it, but I want to show one example. Discovery alone does not tell you whether there's a policy violation within your organization, unless it's, like we mentioned before, the key size, the type of key, and things of that sort, and whether the user should have a key on their system or not. But other things you might not think about is, what about transitive trust? Should a user that's on server A be able to connect to server B, and then should that user actually have access to server C? And furthermore, should they have access to server D? And whenever you look at 2 or 3 connections, transitive trust connections, it may not look that daunting. And this is a simplified scenario that I've come up with, but some customers that we talk with want to have a policy around only the minimum of 3 transitive trust connections, because what can happen is something like this. So what happens is server D might be a jump host, and with this scenario, whoever the user is on server A may have made it somehow to a root-based user account and gain access to pretty much every user, every server within their environment, because they got access to server D. So it's not just enough to look at a single discovery or a single scan. You have to make sure that you scan your whole environment. You have to make sure that you monitor the connections that are coming in on those authorized keys, those public keys, and be able to make the decisions that you need to make as far as policies and remediation. Another example I wanted to bring up, it's actually a real-life example of a large European financial institution, and what they were looking for is whether they had any separation of duties violations. So in this case, you can see that we have a development and production labeled. The development is in green, the production is in yellow. And on the bottom here, you'll see that there's one particular development machine that has quite a few access into many of the production machines. And those production machines, it may be harmless, but I've actually worked at a company where this was a particular violation that they found out, and they only found out after the development machine was putting bad data into those production machines. It caused millions of dollars of loss for that company. So it can be very serious. The other thing I want to point out is you have some of these production machines having access to development. That may not be as serious of a violation, but it certainly could be. You could have accidentally production data getting dumped onto development machines. And because the development machines don't have as strict regulations, strict rules, or monitoring on those machines, there could be a developer or someone that should not have access to restricted information be able to then have access because it's been now dumped onto a development machine. So all this leads up to secure shell keys need to be managed, or SSH keys need to be managed to ensure the organization's machine are and human-based access is being monitored and adhered to for security policies. One more example from the user-based standpoint. We talked about jump hosts and how that's one of the myths or one of the things that some of the customers come back to us and saying that they have this control already in place. If it's not done properly, you can have a scenario like this, where you have a user using a jump host, whether they're using public key authentication to the jump host or password or whatever, and gaining access to a Unix machine. Once they're on that Unix machine, if they have the rights, which in most cases and most organizations we go to, the public keys or the authorized keys are set up in the standard user's home directory. This means that they have rights to add additional keys to that that destination user account that they're logging into. Doing that, they can then bypass the jump host. So if you're relying on your jump host infrastructure to monitor and restrict user access, it's now been bypassed. So if that's the only way that you're monitoring your keys or you're managing your keys, it's not enough. Again, another real-life example. What we have here in the two green machines and the circles in the middle represent jump hosts. And as you can see, many of the connections that are coming in and connecting to the other non-jump hosts are unknown. So they're certainly not coming from the jump host in this scenario. And you see many connections coming from within jump host, or jump host to jump, I'm sorry, not jump, from one host to another host, not going through the jump host. And if you have a rule that machine-to-machine connections don't need to go through jump host, that's fine. But how do you define that? How do you actually get the information? And a one-time discovery isn't enough. You have to do ongoing monitoring to determine, and you have to do definitions of what those connections or those users or the keys are actually being used for, whether it should be an interactive or non-interactive authentication that's going on. Okay, so the risks involved, and certainly as I've kind of gone through some of the risks as I've gone through, but just to spell them out a little bit more, of course, there's vulnerabilities. We've all heard about the breaches and the customer data loss that's happened over the past few years. One perfect example is the mask, the Corretto. It's labeled as an extremely sophisticated and advanced persistent threat that targets documents, encryption keys, SSH keys, VPN connections, and RDP files. This campaign went on for 7 years. Given that, it shows the importance of rotation of keys, because who knows how many private keys that this persistent threat has picked up along the way and can gain access to any number of the systems. We've seen many systems over the years that have keys that are over 10 years old. So it's certainly possible that the private keys that have not been rotated in that time frame and were targeted by something like this could be vulnerable. Of course, the risk of compliance. Everyone in the organization probably has some kind of compliance regulation that they need to adhere to, whether it's NIST, PCI, FFIEC, HIPAA, high-tech, etc. Many more SOX as well and things of that sort. So that's certainly a risk. There's fines associated with not complying, of course, and there's other regulations and restrictions that can happen based on not complying with those compliance regulations as well. And the one that everybody cares about is the financial loss. Losses due to breach, fines, loss of business. One scenario that I was working, or I've heard about, one of not the customer, but one of the companies that I've talked to actually had a situation where they didn't have good management of their keys. They didn't know, the application owners that were responsible for managing their keys wasn't aware that a key was being used for a particular process that was a high-risk process they couldn't go down, essentially. That key was removed, and it caused losses in the millions of dollars just because that one key was removed for a short period of time. They were able to restore the key, so the damage was limited, but there certainly was quite a few dollars lost in that situation. So we're getting close to the end of time, but things to consider. So I wanted to summarize a bit of what can you do now? Like, now that we've provided you kind of the risks and how discovery isn't necessarily enough, you need to go you need to do ongoing management and monitoring of your keys and your environment. What is it that you can do? So first, of course, discovery is important. You need to assess your existing SSH key infrastructure. You need to find out how many SSH keys you use, where you use them, the frequency of the rotation of keys. Many companies or customers that we talk to don't have a rotation schedule because it's not an easy task, because they don't do ongoing management or monitoring. They may do a discovery, but discovery doesn't necessarily get you every single private key. As we mentioned before, the private key is difficult to track down. So you have to do the monitoring on the authorized key, the public key side, in order to get a proper analysis so that you don't remove an authorization that breaks a year-end process, that breaks a quarter-end process, that you may not think is needed anymore. One thing we've talked about especially a lot recently is determining what policies need to be in place for SSH management, key management, and the like, anything related to encrypted traffic and transfers and things of that sort. So getting a policy, if you don't already have one, is key. We can certainly talk with you about that if you'd like, but it's something that we've worked with our customers a lot lately because it is something that they've noticed is lacking in their environment. They aren't sure what the rotation schedule should be or what users should have access to what and how to determine what those users are being used for and things of that sort. Excuse me. So lock and expire SSH keys, which have not been used or given a time frame. Again, that's important of monitoring, of course, to see what keys aren't being used, but you also can lock down your existing SSH keys, your authorized keys, into a directory so that you can't actually, the jump host scenario that we talked about before can't happen. So only a root user or someone that gains root level access would be able to actually set up a new key. And it would allow you to take more control over the setup of new keys or authorizations within your environment so that you actually have good visibility of what's going on and what new authorizations are being created out there. And of course, continually monitoring and centrally managing those keys. Without monitoring, you can't tell whether someone put a new key out there that they weren't supposed to, whether there is now a new development machine that's connecting to a production machine because it was promoted from a development box to a production box for some reason. So very important to continue to monitor, continue to do that discovery on a regular basis, and centrally manage the keys and set up alerts in order to alert of any of the policy violations that might be set up in your environment. So that's pretty much it. Hopefully the summary kind of wrapped things up. I would like to provide you some contact information just in case you have any questions questions or you go back and you think of a question later on, you certainly can contact us through our Contact Us page, which is ssh.com/about/contact. I've also provided my own contact information out there, so you feel free to reach out to me if you'd like. And I certainly want to remind everybody that part 2 of the myth of the private key, the myth of the private key on our Mythcrackers series will be on Thursday, January 28th of next year, of course. And certainly we'll be reaching out to you with details, or you can certainly reach out to us if you want more information on that. And so at this point, I'd like to open it up to questions. If anybody has any questions, please let us know through the chat box.
Thank you, Joe, for that presentation and overview. There have been a few that have come through, and I'd like to open those up to you or Matthew, so you guys can maybe try to address them. Some of them, I think, have some common themes here. The first one I'd like to pose to you and Matthew is, what do you guys or SSH usually see in terms of the average number of keys on a per server basis? So I guess that would mean when we're out doing a discovery phase, what do we traditionally kind of see as a ballpark or average?
I can take that one, Joe, just to kind of give some ideas on that. So, of course, the number of keys that you're going to find across environments are going to vary significantly depending on the use cases of how SSH is being used in that estate. Just to kind of give some reference points of some of the data points we're seeing out in the market space. If we look in, larger enterprises, with environments that are 10,000 Unix, Linux hosts, heterogeneous, we're tending to find a ratio out there of about, let's say, 80% machine-to-machine identities versus 20% of keys being found for, let's say, interactive usage. So this would equate to, if we're thinking of these 10,000 Unix, Linux hosts out there, we're talking, in the range of 1.5 million application keys versus about 75,000 sysadministrator keys, 75,000 database administrator keys, and 10,000 monitoring keys. So in that respect, we're seeing a great, let's say, variance in terms of the number of interactive usage-based keys versus machine-to-machine based keys. And we definitely, also very dependent on the environment you're in again, but where we see a lot more keys on the authorized key side of the equation versus the private key side. But this is also, again, very dependent on the environment. Is there anything you wanted to add, Joe?
No, I mean, I think you covered it. I mean, like you said, there's a wide range. I mean, you can have servers that have 5 keys, and then we've seen some that have over 10,000 keys, and the variation is pretty wide. But I think you pretty much covered it.
Okay, great, gentlemen. There's a few others, and I think these two might go hand in hand. So let me read these two, and you guys can choose how you want to address. One question that came up is, what are some common roadblocks to actually being able to figure out or discover how many keys we might be using? And then the second one is, and I think again it's related, how do I get my hands around at least knowing how many keys I might be using? So that might have tied to the first one, but the key question I see here is, what are some roadblocks that we've encountered when trying to help our customers discover how many keys they have?
Do you want to take the lead on that one, Joe, and then I can add this time?
Yeah, so certainly. So some of the things that we've seen, I mean, the roadblocks are different with every customer. I mean, it's certainly getting access and to the systems in order to do the scan can be troubling for some customers. It's not necessarily troubling for all. Getting people used to the idea, probably the biggest roadblock I've seen is the education around it. Why, when we go into an organization and we try to help them get a handle of their keys and their authorizations that they have set up using SSH keys, is a lot of the work is around the education for the users, getting them to know, getting those application owners to know what their actual keys are being used for, because sometimes you have application owners that inherit keys or inherit applications from previous owners, and they may not know what the keys necessarily used for. They are responsible maybe for rotating those keys or maybe decommissioning those keys if they're no longer being used. but giving them the information, getting the customer the information that they need to make an educated decision has been one of the roadblocks as far as what I've seen in sometimes using tools and things of that sort can certainly give us some of that that information to be able to help them make a better decision.
Okay, sounds great. There are two remaining questions I have, and maybe we can run quickly through these. One is, and I know we can't be specific here, but the participant or attendee was asking, have we here at SSH seen cases where keys have been abused? I'll let you guys take that one. And the last one here is, who wants to take it? Go ahead, sorry.
Sure. No, I'll take that one. So, I mean, we have seen incidents of the misuse of SSH keys. I mean, I think one that has been very open and public about this has been the Sony breach. In this case, SSH was not the attack vector, essentially. However, once let's say the perpetrators got on the inside through whatever attack method they were using, spear phishing or whatnot, they did go pick up all those private keys that they could find there, and they essentially gained access to things like payroll and other very sensitive information. And so if you think about what does this customer have to do, in essence, to become whole again, is it actually has to go out across that environment and change all the authorizations where those private keys connected to. And so this is kind of, again, controlling the locks to the door is essentially the primary philosophy on how we can maintain control in the environment. And this is kind of, a lead into the next session on the myth of the private key around that. Another instance where we see SSH being misused in a very similar way is, as many of you are already aware probably in this session, is that SSH basically has 3 different layers to it. It has a user authentication layer, a host authentication layer, and it has what are known as the subchannels. And so we have seen cases where people were setting up, utilizing key-based authentication and tunneling to, let's say, forward information back to their desktops outside the organization. And essentially, these were picked up not through, issues around the keys, but these were picked up as anomalies in the amount of SFTP data that was being pushed outbound from the organization. And so we do see these scenarios of keys being misused in the environment, and it is for malicious insiders or, let's say, hackers that have come on from the outside to the inside. It is a very easy target for them because it is known that these are primarily unmanaged in the environment, and there's not a good inventory and not a good control to alert on anomalies around key-based authentication. Anything you wanted to add, Jeff?
No, I mean, I think that pretty much, that's some examples. We probably could go over a huge number of examples, and certainly whoever asked the question, if you want to reach out to us, we'll certainly be able to go over some additional details as well on some of the other things we've seen.
Okay, thank you guys. One last question, and this is very timely from what we've seen here with NIST, but the question was, I heard a mention of NIST, but what exactly are you referring to with respect to NIST?
Sure. So the NIST IR 7966 basically is providing guidance to the federal agencies out there, and of course this has, because NIST usually does a very excellent job on these type of guidelines, this does roll into the commercial space, and essentially it is providing guidance on what are the best practices around SSH user key-based access for interactive and machine-to-machine usage, and it takes you through kind of the process of, what is essential to find out when we go discover these keys, the importance of monitoring SSH-based access to give us the intelligence and information around how keys are being used in the environment, the importance of how we stop the bleed and get things under control through a lockdown process and managing the configurations of SSH in a sensible, controllable way, and the type of things that we need to do to go and kind of remediate, let's say, the legacy challenge that has existed in these environments, because unlike SSL certificates, SSH user keys, they have no expiration date. So most enterprises have a significant legacy challenge sitting out there. And then, of course, looking into what are the best practices around the recertification around SSH user keys for, the automation of distribution, removals, rotations, and whatnot. And, just wrapping up this entire guideline of the best practices for interactive and machine-to-machine connectivity for SSH user key-based authentication.
Thank you, Matthew. That is the end of the question sessions we have, or questions that we received. So at this point, I think we can adjourn the session for today. I wanted to take a moment to thank everyone again for your time for joining. And please stay tuned for part 2, which will be the myth of the private key, taking place on Thursday, January 28th. We will be sending invites out regarding that. Again, thank you, Joe and Matthew, for your time today. And thanks to everyone who joined. Have a great day.